What is up guys, Deadset here. One of the most popular specs in patch 2.1 is the Stampede Crusader, and it's no surprise considering the safety, reliability and crowd control potential of the build. Let me show you how to build one of these. I'll begin with the build, which revolves around one of the spender runes of the phalanx skill called Stampede. Stampede is the solitary damage dealer and crowd controller of the build, with the rest of the skill and gear choices being made as supports of this admittedly flashy spender. By default, the rune sends 3 horses to trample the enemy, knocking him backwards and with an impressive 30% chance to stun him on top of everything else. We'll be making use of not 1 but 2 rows of 3 horses each, because of the doubling effect of the unrelenting phalanx shield, but more on that when we get to the gear. Stampede shares certain similarities with another popular spender build, the Holy Shotgun. It's positioning oriented, has a significant wrath cost, requires specific items to make it work, but it has a number of advantages, elevating it to a Greater Rift worthy competitor. It covers a much wider area, the damage is done to everything in a half screen long line, and has hard crowd control built into the skill, which is invaluable against the highly lethal enemies in rifts after level 35. These advantages more than make up for the grand flaw of the build, Stampede's inability to travel over obstacles on the ground. If you're not careful with the places you fight, you can easily lose half or more of your horses to the geometry of the rift. More than anything else, cramped spaces and curved corridors are the enemy of the build, so keep that in mind at all times and position yourself in spaces where your horses will deliver to the maximum of their potential. Playing with the build for a while, you'll easily recognize what I mean. As a final playstyle note, try to utilize the knockback effect of Stampede to push back packs of enemies into even bigger fights to maximize the damage done per wrath spent. The judgment between maximizing resource and biting off more than you could chew is not an exact science, but up to 2 packs of elites should be manageable for a geared Stampede Crusader. To ease the wrath management of the build, I'm using a staple of the high spending builds, Laws of Valor with Unstoppable Force. Reducing your costs by 50% for a period of 10 seconds, extended by the Long Arm of the Law passive, gives you the much needed breathing room to juggle your cooldowns and not starve yourself in this non-Reaper's Wraps Crusader build. Provoke is a skill that I've spared no words praising. It is your only source of wrath generation outside of Akarat's champion, with a very handy attack and movement speed debuff coming from the Too Scared to Run rune on top. While it might seem contradictory that a build thriving on safety and range would make use of a taunting skill, you have generated enough wrath to crowd control the inbound enemy immediately after, and incoming damage will be hampered by the rune's debuff. If you'd rather maintain the safety of your range, however, you could switch to the Flee Fool rune. My problem with this one is the unpredictability of the fear effect. Steed Charge is an invaluable tool in Greater Rifts, one that you might be tempted to drop in favor of a combat or utility-oriented skill, but that you most certainly should not. The trusty horse will take you out of dangerous situations or quickly bring you to the next one, depending on what you need, more times than you can count. And with the chance that you perish in the middle of a level, RNGesus forbid of course, Steed Charge will make the walk back to the fight one of contemplation and shame rather than an unsalvageable mess. I've opted for the longer lasting endurance rune since I often find myself looking for a quick way into the next fight. You could also make use of the synergy of the ramming speed rune with the strong arm bracers, since passing through the enemy once will make the strong arm damage bonus active from the start of your Stampede spam. Note however that this is a more dangerous option, and ramming speed actually knocks aside instead of backwards, which may lead to the enemy scattering in a hard to handle manner. I'll surprise nobody with the inclusion of Akarat's champion in this setup. This mainstay of the endgame Crusader will not only provide you with a hefty 35% damage bonus and 5 wrath per second regeneration, but also 150% armor and an entire second life through the Tanky Prophet rune. While you can easily stomp through Torment 6 and make your Wrath management easier with the Embodiment of Power rune, this video and the build as a whole are more dedicated towards Greater Rift performance, where the squishier runes of Akarat's champion will be a fruitless exercise of frustration. You'll notice we have one more slot to fill, and this one I consider more freeform than the rest, which are pretty much set in stone. Recently I've grown fond of Iron Skin with Steel Skin, a skill that I didn't have a high opinion of before but learned to appreciate. Despite its significant cooldown, it reduces your damage by a whopping 50% and breaks you free from the crowd control as an added bonus. With my imperfect cooldown reduction, it fills the gap whenever my Gogok stacks fall off and generally boosts your survivability in high Greater Rifts. Other viable options include Shield Glare with Zealous Glare or Divine Verdict, or Consecration with Frozen Solid. I highly encourage you to experiment and find what works for you best here. For the passives, I'm going with Heavenly Strength as the usual choice of two-hander builds, which this build is by necessity. Finery as a significant strength booster, even more so with the increasing number of sockets across our gear in patch 2.1 because of legendary gems. Lord Commander as a sizable 20% damage buff to Phalanx with the small bonus of reducing our steed charge cooldown, and Long Arm of the Law for the prolonged active effect of the Unstoppable Force rune, enabling the spam of Stampede horses without too much trouble. This is it for the build, now let's move on to the gear. Endgame Crusaders can't seem to get rid of the omnipotent 6-piece account bonus, and this build is no exception. While Leoric's Crown is a tempting source of additional cooldown reduction, I strongly recommend forgoing the trappings of this transitional piece and focusing on completing your 6-piece accounts with the proper Phalanx bonuses on your helm and boots. Not using Leoric's Crown and the Ring of Royal Grandeur as a consequence, you're free to use both Unity and Stone of Jordan as your rings. For good or ill, the combination of Unity on yourself and your follower, along with an Immortality follower item, is a paradigm of solo play, and you simply cannot pass up 50% damage reduction. The Stone of Jordan, on the other hand, is an immense boost of both physical damage and damage against elites. Note that perfect versions of those rings would have natural sockets, and you'd roll the strength away for cooldown reduction, potentially enabling you more offensive legendary gem choices. To round out the jewelry, I use a mediocre Countess Julia's cameo. I make use of the unique property every now and then, using arcane elites as sources of healing rather than retreating from them, but I would trade that amulet in a heartbeat for one with crit chance, crit damage and physical damage, rolling away the strength for a socket. I mentioned it previously, but my bracers of choice for the build are the Strong Arms. With the constant knockbacks of Stampede, the 30% damage boost from the piece will be up at all times. Wrath management is significantly harder than with the Reaper's Wrap setup, but it's mostly a learning experience and you'll get a feel for it after a while. It's definitely not worth the damage loss. I'll end the armor pieces with the belt. I'm using the 2.1 Debutant Vigilante belt. This previously flavorless belt has been turned into one of the most potent items for Crusaders in this slot, offering you up to 8% of the coveted cooldown reduction. Since you'll likely be lacking in cooldown reduction for a long time, perfect rings are harder than ever to find with the reduced chances to get a Stone of Jordan, the Vigilante belt truly saves the day. Finally, let's talk about the weapon and offhand. For the weapon slot, I'm using the Furnace, an extremely rare two-handed mace that had its unique property of percentage-based damage changed to 40 to 50% increased damage against elites. While this bonus is evident at all times, it shines in Greater Rifts where fights against elites, and especially Greater Rift Guardians, take up the majority of the time and become the deciding factor between successful clear and failure. Outside of Greater Rifts, and until you get a Furnace if you lack one, you can make use of the Heart Slaughter, a polearm with up to 30% increased physical damage. The shield slot is taken up by the mandatory for this build Unrelenting Phalanx. This shield has the unique property of casting your Phalanx twice, effectively doubling the damage of the Stampede rune by giving you a second row of triple horses right behind the first. Note that this shield is not restricted to seasons and you can obtain it in the regular servers as well. The legendary gems of choice for the build are Bane of the Trapped, Pain Enhancer, and Gogok of Swiftness. Bane of the Trapped synergizes perfectly with the control impairing effects of Stampede and is one of the best damage amplifiers in the game. The Pain Enhancer, on the other hand, synergizes with the focus on physical damage in the build. The Gogok of Swiftness is a more interesting and flexible choice as a third gem. Due to the cooldown hardships of the build, especially without absolutely perfect jewelry, the Gogok level to 25 will enable you to have perfectly cycled Akarat's champion at the 15th stack as long as you maintain a reasonable 48 to 49 cooldown reduction in your stat sheet. Your Akarat's champion will snapshot your current cooldown reduction at the time of activation, giving you some leeway with CDR on the gear as long as you pay attention to your Gogok stacks and activate on the 15th. Once I perfect my cooldown reduction across the gear, I might start looking into other damage amplifiers like Bane of the Powerful and Zai Stone of Vengeance. As far as Paragon points go, we're using standard Paragon distribution for Rakan set builds with 25% movement speed and the rest in strength in the core section, cooldown reduction and the rest in crit damage and crit chance in offense, or resistance and then armor or life percentage according to your needs in defense, and area damage and resource cost reduction, then life on hit in utility. And this is it for the build, currently one of the strongest ones in the 2.1 Crusader metagame and the strong contender for the top spots on the leaderboards. I hope you have fun building your Stampede Crusader and you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would appreciate your subscription to my channel, talk to me on Twitter and Facebook that I linked below, watch me live at twitch.tv/thedeadset, and I'll see you guys next time.